Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Contours, the Cambridge Literary Studies Hour. My name is Ato Quayson, and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. We are joined for today's episode by Auritro Majumder, Associate Professor of English Literature at the University of Houston and editor of the Cambridge Companion to the British Empire and Literature. Also joining us are Susan Gillman, Distinguished Professor of Literature at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Anna Brickhouse, the Lyndon Kent Memorial Professor of English and American Studies at the University of Virginia. They are co-editors of the forthcoming Cambridge Companion to American Literature and Empire. Also with us is Baidik Bhattacharya, Associate Professor at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, who is editor of the Cambridge Companion to World Literature and Empire. We hope you find this episode of Contours, the Cambridge Literary Studies Hour, useful, enjoyable, and relevant. And more importantly, that you be encouraged to join us again in the next edition. So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I have a series of questions, starting with a fairly straightforward one, which is I want to invite you to make some comments on your various collections, basically introducing the main themes and the motivations and so on, starting with Susan and Anna.
Thank you so much, Ato, and in general to Cambridge for hosting this wonderful event. Anna and I think, can talk, absolutely extemporaneously about our volume, which we conceived of from the start as a kind of homage and ongoing celebration. So homage to an ongoing celebration of Amy Kaplan, who is the major scholar, I think, of the last 30 years in the production of American empire studies as literary studies. And maybe Anna can jump in here.
Sure, yeah. Just to put a personal note on it, when Ray asked us about taking up this project of doing a Cambridge Companion, it was fairly. Amy had died pretty recently, and she was a dear friend of Susan's. She was kind of an informal mentor to me, and she was a beloved colleague to so many Americanists and other scholars. And it happened that the inquiry came right at this moment, and Amy Kaplan was one of the scholars to inaugurate the new-ish field of empire and American literature, or I should say to inaugurate the version of it of that moment in the early 90s. And she was so key in part because she pointed out how the field of American studies itself was founded and structured around the absence of empire. And I'm sorry about my cat in the picture here. She only does this when she hears me talking to the computer.
She's very scholarly.
Well, the worst is when she shakes the computer, but she's not doing that right now. But so Amy Kaplan was so important for pointing out that the field itself was founded around an insistence on the absence of empire, around the idea that the imperial and American were somehow contradictory terms. And she traced that out really beautifully in a landmark essay. And that led to a whole host of scholarly studies on empire and American literature. And so that's how it came about, and it was a labor of love. It was a chance to have a collectively told story about empire and American letters that we hope can be for this historical moment. And I'm trying to think about one other point I would make about it is that there's maybe a particular challenge for Americanists taking up the study of literature and empire in the question of how to renounce exceptionalism and yet still hold to the idea that there's a special responsibility that Americanists have precisely because of this long absence of empire in national self-understanding. So how to not claim something unique about what it is that scholars of empire and American literature are doing. The field is so beholden to post-colonial studies, to decolonial studies coming out of Latin America. And yet we feel that there is a special responsibility that comes with being someone who studies the particular U.S. case because of that absence and because the U.S. has currently plays such an outsized role in questions of empire today. I'm sorry, now my cat is shaking the computer.
Just to put a final point on that, we really wanted to use Amy Kaplan's work. The volume is a labor of love and also a way to use Amy Kaplan's work from the 1990s, which was such a formative moment for thinking differently about American empire based on this thesis of absence. We wanted to use her work to say, what could we say now about exactly Anna's point, the special responsibility that doesn't lead to American exceptionalism? What could we say about that kind of contradictory project now in the 2020s that you couldn't say then? And so we wanted to mark some kind of distance from that really formative moment while also acknowledging it. So there it is. It's the contradictions in the study of the United States and empire. And that might lead to comments from both Baidik and Auritro on other ways to approach empire in their contexts.
Right. Thank you very much, Susan and Anna. Shall we go next to Baidik?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Ato, and thanks to Cambridge University Press for hosting us today. It's a wonderful opportunity to have a dialogue on three very interesting anthologies which are coming out very soon. The one I'm editing is called World Literature and the British Empire. Initially, during the early discussions with Ray, we thought we would call it simply World Literature and Empire. Then it became so big and so unmanageable that we finally decided to zero in on British Empire. Because if you think of modern empire, there are so many from 18th century onward that it was almost unmanageable to contain everything in one single volume. So we decided to focus on British Empire, and partly also because this is my specialization. I'm familiar to some extent about other imperial formations through secondary work, but British Empire is what I work on, so I'm more familiar with its archival material and also the secondary work that has been done on imperial histories. So basically, that was the idea that, as you know very well, the idea of world literature has swept through literary departments across the globe in the last 2.5 decades or so. After the initial and quite pioneering work by scholars like David Damrosch, the late Pascal Casanova, Franco Moretti, and others, it became one of the major ways to address the realities of globalization. As Feng Chia puts it, that it was literary scholars' discovery of globalization through renewing the Goethean model of a Goethean idea of world literature for 21st century. Now, after the initial phase of celebration, that we have finally found a literary framework or a theoretical paradigm which would directly speak to or directly address the contemporary realities of a globalized literary culture. There were some dissenting notes, some dissenting voices, some critiques. And one of the major strands that came out as a kind of, nuanced, engaged, kind of narrative came out from post-colonial studies. You have a series of authors like Amir Mufti, Siraz Ahmed, Peng Chia, and many others, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. Many of them argue that imperial history has to be taken into consideration when we think of this idea of world literature. Without empire or without modern empires from 18th century onwards, what we can describe as modern European empires, the British, the French, the Dutch, etc., that without taking this vast history, it would be a partial version of world literature. This is where I also come in. I also have done some work in this area, but this work is very scattered across different locations. So Ray and I thought we'd try to put an anthology which would bring these different ideas or streams of thought about empire and world literature together in one volume. That was the initial idea that we'll try to put together, because already a lot has been written, a lot has been said about this connection between the British Empire particularly and the idea of world literature. Now, how to put some of these ideas together in one volume in an accessible form so that students, scholars, faculty members, all of them can go to one place and check the scholarship that already exists. So that was the initial idea, and that
So,
developed.
Baidik,
Sorry.
could you curb your enthusiasm
Yes.
a little bit?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
So that was the initial idea that then flourished into a whole book.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to shorten your answer because there's
Not
so
at all,
many
not at all.
and there's so
Yes,
much
yes.
to discuss. Believe me. So, Auritro.
Thank you very much, Ato, and thanks to my wonderful co-panelists. It's wonderful to join all of you here today. So the collection that I'm editing is called the Cambridge Companion to British Literature and Empire. It is coming out next month, in October of 2025. And so it was the result of, I think maybe 4 years of working with a very diverse group of international scholars, from different parts of the world. And so the initial idea was, to try and make sense, as some of my co-panelists already mentioned, right? The enormous amount of work that has already been done over the past 2, even 3 decades. But when I was talking to Ray Ryan at Cambridge University Press, we both noted the absence of recent work that provides an overview, right? I remember, Ray mentioning, Edward Said's Orientalism, which kind of does that pioneering sort of work, but that was, 40 more than 40 years ago. If we look at Benita Perry's work, even older, right? And so the idea was to try and provide a sense of the updated scholarship, something that has happened, but only people, within their sort of subfields know about, and to try and span out into a broader realm. And so I'm very happy to say, that the companion, as it's going to be published, spans, from the 16th century to the 21st, right? And basically looks at writing that was produced or circulated within the British Isles, right? And connecting England to its internal sort of peripheries. I almost want to say colonies, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, right? To the larger empire beyond, connecting, say, for example, the Caribbean to Australia and New Zealand, right? West and South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on.
Thank you. Thank you so much, you all. One of the, and of course, this is an area dear to my heart, but one of the things that I often think about is the larger curricular problem. That is to say, how do we synchronize our interest in literature and empire in general to the rest of the curriculum? And I've been thinking quite a bit about this. And one of the things I think about is the relationship between large templates, such as empire, and the representation of individual doubt. So, empire, so literature and empire and the production of doubt. I have several examples, but one that we're all obviously familiar with is Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe has doubt about the capacity of representing what he calls the dream content, which is the nightmare of the Congo. But this moment of the admission to the difficulty of representing his experiences in the Congo sets the novel apart from the masculine adventure narratives of the 19th century. G.A. Henty, H. Rider Haggard, and so on, where there was no doubt. So in King Solomon's Mines, the Brits in Southern Africa don't have a doubt about the rightness or justness for them being in empire. So Conrad's Heart of Darkness was in a way the first to express doubt to the point where even the problem of representation was at issue. So how would you, and again, back to my earlier proposition about synchronizing our vast areas to the curriculum in general, what examples might you adduce from your collections about the relationship of literature and doubt with specific literary examples, just to, entice our skeptical colleagues? So starting back to Susan and Anna.
I would start with our volume really made an effort to draw on texts that are written about broader empires, other empires than simply the US. And so in part one of our book, we have on early colonial, so the 16th to the 18th centuries. There are two works that one is on the Haitian Revolution and a work on how thinking against the revolution, thinking against the imperial context, drew on environmental thinking in early Haitian writing. And I think that work, which I think was a nonfiction work, Anna, isn't that right?
You're
Anna,
muted.
You're muted.
Your cat has muted you.
Sorry, the cat left for a minute too, which is good. The work, it's not it's actually a work that blends genres. It's by the Haitian writer Gérard Dumel.
That's it, Dumel.
And it draws on natural history and descriptive descriptive language of natural history, but also these other genres, including poetry, to and it draws what the argument that our writer Monique Alouert makes is that, and this is a really early Haitian work from the 19th century. She makes the argument that it's taking up one of the most imperial of genres, the natural history, but also drawing on indigenous and African cosmologies to, I'm trying to use the language of doubt here, but to reconceive nature in a way that casts doubt on the imperial conception of nature, to reconceive nature as an anti-imperial force in itself. And in terms of the question of doubt more broadly, I mean, we don't have an essay on Columbus in this volume, but Ato, as soon as you began giving your Heart of Darkness example, I thought, if I were trying to teach along this model that you're mentioning of doubt, I would take the first letter that Columbus wrote And then I would take the fourth and last letter that he wrote about his voyages to the New World, because the first one is all certainty. It's paradise. It's the smooth course of empire unfolding. The last letter is howling, screaming doubt. I wouldn't have thought about it until you gave the example of Heart of Darkness, but I love the idea of teaching a course on empire and letters that makes certainty and doubt. It's kind of it's dialectical
The
relationship.
contradiction expressed in that circuit. I really actually so much agree, because American literature and empire has so frequently addressed either pro or con in this kind of limited way, and using doubt as your central way of thinking allows, I think, for more nuanced approaches. And even, I think Ato's bringing up genre. What are the genres or the combination of genres that can foster doubt as opposed to certainty? And our book is very interested in speculative thinking, as C.L.R. James quotes Hegel. And I think that's another, maybe we can talk about that generic hybridity.
Wonderful. So how about this time, Auritro first?
Yes, thank you, Ato. I was very glad for the texts you mentioned, because as it turns out, this collection has two chapters on that exact theme. One is talking about the Victorian adventure fiction as a kind of colonial romance, right? Where my colleague Shrundi Banerjee talks about both Rider Haggard, but also what was called mutiny fiction, right? In the context of the Indian uprising, Philip Meadows Taylor's Sita, and so that's one chapter, and the other chapter sort of takes up the time immediately after, where another colleague, Dominic Davis, talks about John Buchan, then Edward Thompson and E.M. Foster, Passage to India and things like that. And so the question of how adventure fictions sort of both register, right, empire, but also sort of trace its unraveling, can be seen in both of these chapters, through the presentation, precisely as you pointed out, through things like doubt, anxiety, a sense of horror, right? So very subjective kind of factors. And it's not as if, that Victorian fiction was, completely self-confident, and then we see that self-confidence raveling, right? We have that sort of diachronic development, but also synchronic sort of differences, right? So, for example, Rider Haggard and Taylor, right? They are writing pretty much in the same time period, but have different sort of attitudes when it comes to empire. So I would say that there are two things that are important. One is the idea of genre, right? That's already been mentioned, right? That how certain genres, evolve and develop over time, and that helps to capture, register or articulate certain historical changes that are taking place. But also more broadly, I think the idea of literary, prefiguration, right, something that Frederick Jameson employs, is quite useful as well, in the sense that literature often manages to articulate, right, to spell out, to elaborate or illuminate things that are only, half visible in the quote unquote actual world.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Baidik?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's a very intriguing one. See, one of the ideas behind the volume I'm editing today is to bring these two conceptual worlds face to face. On the one hand, world literature, on the other hand, British imperial history, and to allow or to encourage the reader to see one through the other. I'll give you two examples. The contributors that we have, they are engaging with both archival material, also literary texts. So in one essay, for instance, the very idea of world literature, as we know, is based on the notion of comparativism. Comparative method is at the heart of world literature kind of paradigm. So I have one essay by Siraj Ahmed where he is looking at the archives of modern European empires from late 18th century onwards in South Asia, in Northern Africa, in Southeast Asia, and where he is looking at this deployment of philology, or rather invention of historical or comparative philology to colonial governance. It was basically a technique that was employed to translate legal texts initially, but that became a knowledge paradigm, comparative philology. And comparative philology is the bedrock for all comparative methods that we have today. It is the original comparative. So how something like comparative literature transforming into world literature came into being cannot be understood without this colonial genesis of comparative methods through the deployment of comparative philology. That is one idea that he develops in his book, in his article. I have another article by Paulo Horta where he's looking at what is arguably one of the first international bestsellers, which is 1001 Nights, or which is more commonly known as the Arabian Nights. Right? It's an Arabic text. More correctly, it is an Arabic oral tradition, but it became an international bestseller through successive translations, through colonial missions. First in French through Galland, then in English through Lane and Barton, and then in almost every major languages across the world. The story cycle is available. So how does a text become world literary? Through successive translations, through its interaction with the colonial structure, through its circulation to various imperial networks, and so on and so forth. So the reader would be able to see both these in new lights, that how our discipline of literary studies came into being, comparative literature, world literature, etc., how certain texts became world literary in through and in colonial history. So this is something I think would be an interesting thing to look at.
Mhm. I like to, when I'm thinking of, large scale things, in this case, empire, I like to anchor at least the preliminary process through specific literary examples. So I gave Heart of Darkness. I'm going to issue another one to link to a question, which is Graham Greene's, and of course now nobody reads Graham Greene, for God's sake, but still, he's a very wonderful writer. But Graham Greene's The Heart of the Matter. So From the Heart of Darkness to the Heart of the Matter, published in 1948. And it's about an English policeman stationed in Sierra Leone in West Africa during the Second World War. And his job is to oversee the port and make sure that diamonds are not being smuggled. So this is his task. But he also happens to be a Catholic. And he happens to be a Catholic, and he happens to have fallen out of love with his wife, who, by the way, is a literary type. She reads voraciously. And, to cut a long story short, he starts an affair, and he has an affair, and he feels very guilty about it. His wife, at the same time, is also, of course, she is also falling out of love with him, and so on and so forth. At the end of the novel, Scobie, his name is Scobie, commits suicide. And by committing suicide, he has, as it were, enacted the worst excision from a Catholic god imaginable. So my question is, how does empire connect to various institutions of sentiment? Here, the Catholic Church is an institution of sentiment, but we have various institutions of sentiment, such as the family. It's different from the church. The family is an institution of sentiment, ritual, both traditional and otherwise. How does empire either distort? Because often the effect is distorting. as you find from the novels of Chinua Achebe, for example. So empire and sentiment, let me simplify. How do the novels in your various wonderful works depict the relationship between empire and sentiment? Starting this time with Auritro.
Uh, that's a wonderful question, and because I'm going first, I may not have the most succinct answer, but let me try. So one way of answering your question, so we when we start the volume, the first text that is covered is Thomas More's Utopia, right? Which it's a very hard to define text generically. It's a frame narrative. You could call it a travel tale, or even to use an anachronistic term, a kind of science fiction. And the last text covered is Aisha Malik's, this Green and Pleasant Land, which is from 2020. Both of them refer to islands, right? Both Moore and Malik, and both sort of deploy the idea of pastoral on one hand and nostalgia on the other, right? So the concept of sentiment, for example, I think comes in very handy. And to just make an extra literary reference for a second, right? So today I think we are suffused with the idea of imperial nostalgia, both in the context of Britain, but also very much so in the United States. And so the way these texts deal with the question of nostalgia, right, is very interesting, right? Malik, for example, is very deliberately deploying tropes of the pastoral, right? I mean, the novel is called, The Green and Pleasant Land, but then also sort of undercutting those very tropes, right, in order to present sort of a counter reality, for people of color, immigrants like her family members, the fictional family in the novel who sort of struggle to adjust, to England on the verge of Brexit. And so in some ways, again, to go back to a point I made earlier, that these generic transformations, right, how pastoral starts, from the sense of the discovery of the new world in the 16th century, right, and so all the various debates about whether this new world is going to be wonderful or whether it's going to be a threat, to the established social order. In Thomas More's Utopia, sort of comes back, right, almost full circle, as it were, 500 years later.
Thank you so much.
Very welcome.
Auritro. Baidik, sentiment and empire.
Yes. Let me take one example that you very briefly mentioned in your question, which is the question of family. How family configures in this narrative of what we are doing with world literature and fiction. One of the early essays in my collection describes modern empires as a project which took away the legal authority from particularly Islamic clerisy and gave it a textual stability which was completely new. Right? This happened in South Asia, this happened in Northern Africa, this happened in Southeast Asia. This is one major theme which produced a new legal regime. Now, new legal regime also created new institutions like family. In South Asia, for instance, the very idea of family, both in Islamic law and in Hindu law, those were the two major legal options before the British officials. They were defined in very new ways. Family got a very different notion, very different identity through this restructuring of legal regimes. Right? This is something one of the contributors explores in his contribution. Towards the end, we have another contribution which looks at post-colonial fiction, post-colonial Anglophone fiction, which is the kind of aftermath of the empire. And post-colonial Anglophone fiction is a world literary phenomenon, as we know very well. There, she is looking at a particular novel, which is God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, and which is about the very idea of family. Now, there is a very interesting trajectory from late 18th century to late 20th century. The idea and the way the institution of family has evolved through various documents, through legal, through fictional, through novelistic, across genres, across forms, across different styles of writing, different kinds of writing. That is, I think, is an interesting journey that the reader will be able to connect to.
Thank you, Baidik. Susan and Anna and Hekat.
Anna, you want to start, and I'll come in.
I'll start. So, thinking about the question about the Graham Greene novel and empire and sentiment, religion, family, nostalgia, and doubt, continuing the theme of doubt, I'm going to pick for my text, I'm going to pick Herman Melville's Benito Cereno. And that's a text that gets taken up by a wonderful scholar, Emilio Irigoyen, who's from the University of Montevideo in Uruguay. And so he does the big Melville chapter for our companion. And what's so great about, or why this is such a good text for thinking about empire and sentiment, is that it's also tells us something about how we need comparative empire studies sometimes to understand key questions. So it's about an encounter of an U.S. American sea captain who comes across a Spanish ship off the coast of Chile in South America. And the ship is very strange, and he can't figure out what's wrong with it. And it's a slave ship, and he sees a great deal of disorder on the ship. And the whole thing is told from the American captain's point of view. And he sees a kind of family when he looks at this ship. He sees the Spanish captain. He's really a Creole Latin American, but he refers to him as a Spanish captain, and the enslaved man who serves as his manservant. He sees them as a kind of married couple. The American captain approves of this family relationship that he sees, but then he sees disorder in what he conceives of as a family. And I almost don't want to give away the ending for anyone who hasn't read it, but it's a text that makes us think about how sentiment and empire go hand in hand, because the American thinks that everything happens in history and in his life because of his good sentiments. He thinks that because he's a person who thinks honestly and is optimistic and believes in providence, that's why things unfold the way they do. And he thinks that the Spanish, there's a lot of anti-Catholicism, or Melville's addressing the issue of anti-Catholicism. He thinks that empire and Catholicism have produced a crumbling, out of control empire and bad sentiment. And so it's a text that feels like it's about the policing of proper sentiment within empire, but ultimately it's completely undone, and you leave with doubt on every front. So that's why I'm going to put that up there with your Graham Greene text.
Thank you so much, Susan.
I was probably not ironically also thinking of American texts that deal with the Spanish Empire as opposed to the U.S. And my two examples, I was torn between one of our writers, Rodrigo Lazo, writes about a very little known Cuban novel by a woman. I think it's Sofia. De la Plaine? That's it, De la Plaine. And it's about her imprisonment by the Cuban authorities during a trip to Cuba. And he calls this genre, which is an emerging or evolving genre in the way that I think Auritro is talking about, torturetainment. And it's about the relationship between her and the Cuban authorities, which ends up being this one of torture. So that was one I wanted to think about because it involves anti-Catholicism, the concern about the violence of imperialism inflicted on a woman. And it is that idea of the paternal authorities treating her in that way. The other text would be a much more recent, also little known one. Catherine Ramirez writes about Javier Zamora's 2022 memoir, Solito. And it's a migrant memoir that's imagined as written by a child narrator. And it's about his familial disruption, his particular point of view, which is the child's point of view, which happens to have much more affect and interest than most of these, than other adult authored migrant narratives. And I think both of those, in concert with Benito Cereno, could be a certain kind of comparative canon that's emerging, that's not solidified, that you could talk about multi-genred, that may possibly come to a canon of doubt and uncertainty. Exactly what I think Ato is getting at.
Yeah, without planning it, we've actually just devised a magnificent syllabus. Amongst ourselves, we have the text, we have the theory, we have the concept. So we have a beautiful syllabus. But I now have a provocative question. Hart and Negri, in their book Empire, which we are all, of course, familiar with, 2000, declared, I think quite pompously, that empire was basically dead, that the concept was moribund, and their reasoning was that there was no single source of authority in terms of thinking about the world and how it was to value was to be distributed and so on and so forth. So Antonio, Hart and Negri, Empire. Of course, we are all using empire here. How do you address this provocation that the concept of empire is actually a waste of time? This is a provocation. Starting from Baidik.
I think we need to make a distinction between the way we are using the notion of empire, particularly say for my volume. It's a very historical notion of empire. That is why we decided to call it British Empire instead of just empire. So it's a very historically situated idea of empire, particularly of the modern variation, the modern European empires from late 18th century onwards. What Hart and Negri does, for them, it's not so much this history, but the conceptual greed that was redundant, right? That they thought was dead. I think in the subsequent years, they have been proven thoroughly wrong. The way the idea of empire, the conceptual notion of empire comes back again and again in our contemporary politics. We are all looking at various different imperial formations or imperial ambitions across the world right now in our contemporary world. That doesn't really support Hart and Negri's ambitious utterance or, as you said, rather pompous assertion that the concept of empire is dead. So we need to make that distinction. One is a historical argument where you are looking at actual empires, existing empires, their archives, their literary texts, etc., etc. As you mentioned, Conrad, for instance, right? You cannot read Conrad without empire. So that is one way of thinking about it. The other is the abstract conceptual notion of empire that they are more interested in. I think that would be a very important distinction for me.
No, thank you. I completely agree with you. Susan and Anna.
Just very quickly, and Anna can break in. We took that question on. Empire singular, I'm just adding, to Ato's provocation, as a waste of time, exclamation point. We did take that question on in the issue of thinking about our title, the Cambridge Companion to American Literature and Empire. They're all singular nouns or adjectives. And we brought up the idea of just very concretely pluralizing them, based in part on what was happening in the 1990s when Amy Kaplan produced with Don Pease, The Cultures of U.S. Imperialism. That title also had the S at the end of cultures. And there was a lot of attention to the term America as a singular term, instead needing to put the S on it and acknowledging the hemispheric presence of America or reality of America. And there was also during the 90s what we all remember as canon expansion, where the literature of each national tradition was being subject, particularly the US, that's the one we know the best in this country, was being subject to, let's look for other voices, the silenced voices, etc., the disavowed voices, and add them to the canon. And that had its own expansionist problem. So our volume tries to locate non-English language, some in translation to bring up Baidik's point about translation, some in translation, works that we're not presenting as having ever been silenced in their own traditions. They weren't. So the original, the natural history work on Haiti that we were talking about was a known work at its own very early moment. And our idea on this one is you can pluralize the study of American literatures and empires without solidifying a singular canon. And we called that the kind of problem of additive logic. We had, a few fancy terms for what we thought we were arguing against, which would be that how do you respond to the art and negri provocation? You pluralize empires instead of thinking of it as a monolithic singular thing, which is in part what they were addressing.
Thank you, Anna.
I'd be curious to know whether Auritro and Baidik, whether you addressed Hart and Negri in the introduction to the volume. We originally had not done that, and then, or at least in our proposal, and we were asked to go back and think about Hart and Negri specifically, and it was easy in a way because there were American studies scholars right from the get-go who were saying, even if empire with a capital E in its monolithic singular form is, even if we buy into the existence of this new corporate neoliberal, diffuse but dominant thing that has surpassed all the nation-based forms of empire, even if we bought into that, American studies scholars at the time argued the U.S. still plays an outsized role in, even if particular leaders are taking a backseat in multinational corporations. And so it was Matthew Fry Jacobson who, in his presidential address, begged Americanists, don't take your eye off the ball of empire, just because this new fancy book is out, and keep this line of study alive and well. And but I'm trying to think, towards the end of the working on this, I tried to think about what's useful in Hart and Negri, what we could take from it that is how it still resonates. And we concluded with an afterword on a poet, Raza Ali Hassan, who has a poem called On Imperialism in a book called Sorrows of the Warrior Class. And somehow when I read this very short poem, I did think of, it's a poem that layers multiple empires, from the early modern Mughal dynasty to U.S. intervention in 20th century Guatemala to things happening in 21st century Pakistan. That's happening in the whole work. And in this single poem on imperialism, something about Hart and Negri, I thought of their book in reading this short poem, because I did have a sense of the dizzying way that, not that I believe in a singular empire, but the dizzying way that we can't find words for all the layers of histories of empires that have compounded to create the world as we know it today. So that's what
Thank
I would
you.
say.
Auritro.
Yes, so I do address the Hart and Negri sort of critique in my introduction, and I also mentioned something which I think is going to be worth repeating here today, which is, that not only from the left, but we also had critiques from the right. So, for example, the historian Niall Ferguson's book, How Britain Made the Modern World. And as recently as 2017, the political scientist Bruce Gillies' article, which was titled, very unironically, "The Case for Colonialism." And among literary scholars, I think Timothy Brennan wrote a wonderful critique of Hart and Negri, like almost shortly after that book's publication. So it's it's a contested sort of issue, and something that readers of all three volumes would want to know more about. Now, to go back to something that you talked about, Atto, earlier, right, that how does literature respond to these changes, to the question of empire and its validity today. And my favorite sort of go-to example for that, perhaps because it's so widely known, is Shakespeare's The Tempest, and how, as a text, it is read and reread, multiple times in different times and place. So Susan, for example, mentioned the idea of pluralizing literatures. One could argue that this is a text that has itself been pluralized multiple times. So we have everybody from, say, Rabindranath Tagore in the 19th century to a whole host of American thinkers, Rodo, then Aimé Césaire, Sylvia Wynter, Roberto Retamar, and so on, right? Sort of pluralizing that same text over and over again. Now, of course, as scholars, you know this, but I find that students don't. Right? And so it is something that is worth teaching about as well, rather than thinking of texts as sort of belonging to an outdated canon or archaic sort of history, to talk about its very relevance for the present moment.
Thank you so
I
much.
love that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's our canon discussion, our underlying canon discussion, our ghostly, that's also really interesting.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's wonderful. This will be the final question, and it has to do with another thing that's bugging me, and that is the relationship between not so much empire, I must admit, but sovereignty and delirium. So delirious sovereignty. And you see different articulations of this idea of delirious sovereignty in the United States, especially after September 11th, where the external threat, which was always suspected to be there and imminent, was materialized in the bombing of the towers. But that threat was then connected to a sense of fear that the glue that held America was that America was also fragmenting from the inside. So the rise of feminist movements or Black Lives Matter and so on. But September 11th brought those two sides of delirium together. Of course, we have the great example of Russia, Russia on Ukraine. The idea that somehow if they don't occupy and take over this land, Ukraine will open up a flank to undo them. So the NATO will open up Ukraine as a dangerous flank to undo Russia. All these are aspects of what I think are delirious sovereignty. How does empire produce different forms of delirium? So this is my question. How does empire produce? Because in a way, empire was a delirious enterprise. Both the territorial expansion, the establishment and implementation of laws that were not organic to the places that were Baidik reference, the family law, and so on and so. There's a lot of delirium. So what's the relationship between empire and delirium? And we're not even talking about settler colonialism, America as a settler colonial society. All the delirious encounters with various native populations, same in Canada, same in Australia. So empire as a form of delirium. Starting with Susan and Anna.
Want me to go first?
Yeah, I can see that open mouth.
Well, two chapters in our collection come to mind, and one is an early chapter on Native American literature. What I like about this chapter is it's in part one, which is early American, but it actually connects to part three, which is contemporary, and it's a co-authored chapter, so that it moves from the 18th century up to the contemporary moment. And the central argument of the chapter is that Native American writers across the centuries have understood empire to be a form of apocalypse, and that, to me, that relates to delirium because it exposes the delirium of the settler colonial project. It's when you write something that depicts settler colonialism as a form of apocalypse, you show how delirious the whole project is. And then I had a second chapter in mind, but it just went out of my head. So Susan,
part three one.
Maybe.
It wasn't Rodrigo Lazo's?
It might have been. It may have been something from. I think it may have been from Josie Saldana Portillo's chapter on speculative fiction as anti-colonial theory, and she's looking at Indigenous and Latinx film and literature, and she these contemporary, and these texts often are actually about delirium, about, I'm thinking of one film, and the title of it's going to escape me, but where you're in a state of delirium from beginning to end, and you're not sure what time the film is actually set in. And it's a Mexican film that has to do with settler colonialism in Mexico.
Yes.
Well, all I would add is I was thinking of speculative fiction, and our part three ends with a range of different ways of thinking about SF, including sci-fi. And I can't remember who brought up science fiction earlier. Auritro, sci-fi and imperial nostalgia. And the very last chapter of our book is Josie Saldana's amazing kind of provisional compendium of all of these different works, filmic and literary, on from different traditions. So Indigenous, Latin American, on speculative ways of thinking about speculative fiction. So I think that would be one response to Ato, is this whole, we have such an explosion right now, even of anthologies of speculative visual culture. That might be a way of thinking about delirious sovereignty, which is itself such a speculative idea or an invention. So I think Anna kind of, spoke to exactly what I was imagining, which is the speculative as one of the things that we've uncovered as a key area for thinking about empire in 2025.
Wonderful, wonderful. Auritro,
Uh, yes, thank you. So I want to, because Susan and Anna have spoken so beautifully about the delirious already, science fiction. I want to focus a little bit on the other term, which is sovereignty. And it's interesting, there's something in this context, something Rudyard Kipling said is, I think, significant, that what do they know of England, right? That only England know. And C.L.R. James subsequently sort of tweaked it and almost flipped it on its head with his incredible sort of comment where in Beyond the Boundary, saying, what do they know of what do they know of cricket that only cricket know? And he's talking about how cricket as a game, as an imperial game, sort of took roots in the Caribbean, and what sort of anti-colonial sort of purposes it was put to. So not only literature, but even sports becomes part of James's historic sort of vision. And so I think the question of delirious sovereignty, right, it's something that involves in some ways a projection, right, of the irrationality that is at the heart of empire, as Atto, I think, very beautifully put it, onto the other. And so we see this, for example, if you look at English poetry, we see this all the way from, say, the Romantics, down to the 20th century, right? And I mean, not only in poetry, but in other forms of literary works as well, right? Where various groups become sort of the receptacle for the projection of delirium. But in another sense, I was thinking of delirious sovereignty as also relating to the individual, right, in a state of delirium. In other words, a state of fantasy, in a state of dreaming, and so on. And that is, again, tied very much to the idea of the creative writer and the creative poet. And the reason I brought up Kipling and James is precisely to show that some ideas of delirious sovereignty in terms of the literary imagination can and they do actually get flipped. So think of the intersection between modernism and anti-colonialism. I think it's an excellent example of how such things can be done in the face of imperial delirium.
Thank you so much. Baidik, you have the last word.
Okay. I just want to spend a few words on this very notion of sovereignty. This is not something which is fully addressed in the collection that I'm editing, but this is something I have worked on, and there are essays which refer to this central idea of sovereignty, that this modern notion of sovereignty, contra Foucault and others, was not shaped in Europe. It was actually shaped in the colonies, right? This very transition of the idea of sovereignty from a body of sovereign to a body of texts. This is something that didn't happen in Europe. It happened in the colonies. The colony is where, for the first time, they wanted to establish a sovereignty on texts, legal texts. I can give you the example of South Asia, for instance. They started from 1772 onwards. They had this huge project of translating native legal texts into English as the basis of colonial rule and colonial sovereignty. So they published a series of translations, primarily from Islamic law like Sharia and Hindu legal codes like the Dharma Shastra tradition, for instance. Right? This is one example. The other parallel is the United States, the written constitution, which again came into being around the same time, late 18th century. So late 18th century onwards, we have a new fashioning of this notion of sovereignty, which happened in the colonies or ex-colonies or erstwhile colonies, like the United States, or the current colony like India, for instance, or in North Africa or in Southeast Asia. One after another, you see the same pattern being repeated. So this notion of sovereignty, modernity, the modern sovereign, or sovereignty within the modern episteme, as Foucault would have said, is precisely what was produced through colonial history. That is something I think is important to underline. And the second and last point I would make is there is a very interesting connection between this textual notion of sovereignty and our modern concept of the literary. Just the way the literary is short of any extra textual reference. Modern sovereignty is also textual in the similar way. It does not refer to anything beyond a textual word, just the way the literary functions. I'm not suggesting one followed the other or one imitated the other, but they're co-produced phenomena. That is why in India you see these early colonial officials, they're translating legal texts. Say, I'll take one example, Sir William Jones. He translated Al-Shiraziyah, which was a major text in Islamic law. He translated Manusmriti, which was a major text in Hindu Dharma Shastra tradition. And he also translated Shakuntala, the literary text, the play, Kalidasa's play, Shakuntala. So this is a very interesting trajectory between sovereignty and the new idea of the literary that we can read against each other.
Very good. Thank you so much. So thank you all so much for joining me. And I hope that we'll continue our conversation in various other forums.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a
So
pleasure.
much.